June 1942. Rabaul, New Britain. The air is thick with heat and arrogance. Imperial Japanese Navy pilots of the Tainan Air Group gather around a mapboard, laughing. They've never lost a battle in the sky. An intelligence photo passes from hand to hand. An American fighter, absurd in shape. Two tails, one cockpit in the middle. Twin engines like swollen shoulders. They call it a two-tailed witch. Too big, they say. Too heavy. Too slow to turn. The laughter rolls through the hut. They don't know they're staring at the future. 3 years earlier, at Lockheed's plant in Burbank, California, a young engineer named Kelly Johnson designed something the world had never seen. 2 turbocharged engines, counter-rotating props, all guns mounted in the nose. A Predator built for altitude and speed. It wasn't supposed to be elegant. It was supposed to kill bombers before they reached America's coast. The first time it flew across the United States, it shattered records. They called it the Lightning. And when war came, that lightning struck in the Pacific. At first, the pilots who flew it didn't trust it. It was heavy, temperamental, and its liquid-cooled engines hated tropical heat. But when they learned its secret, when they climbed high, everything changed. Up there, above 25,000 feet, the Lightning could do what no Japanese plane could. Breathe. March 1943. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A Japanese convoy crawls across the water toward New Guinea. Above it, the new P-38s arrive. Captain Thomas Lynch rolls his Lightning over, engines screaming in the dive. His guns speak once, and a Zero simply vanishes. Another follows. In minutes, the sky is filled with fire. By sunset, 8 ships burn on the horizon. Survivors whisper of a silver twin-tailed demon that fell from the clouds. The name sticks. The two-tailed devil. Japanese engineers examine wreckage and cannot believe what they find. Automatic dive flaps. Turbo superchargers that keep full power at 30,000 feet. A fighter that can fly home on one engine. They built swords. The Americans built hammers. By 1943, the Lightning is unstoppable. In the hands of Richard Bong, Tommy Maguire, and Charles McDonald, it becomes legend. Bong scores 40 victories, the highest-scoring American ace of the war, all in a P-38. He doesn't fight like the Japanese. He climbs high, dives through their formations at 400 miles an hour, fires once, and is gone. The Zero can't follow. Its engine chokes. Its wings twist. Its armor tears apart under the Lightning's guns. April 1943. The Americans intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flight over Bougainville. 16 P-38s fly 400 miles over open ocean to a single point in time. At 9:34, they appear from the clouds. 20 seconds later, Yamamoto's bomber falls in flames. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor is gone. Back in Rabaul, Japanese pilots stare at the news in disbelief. How did the Americans know? How did those twin-tailed monsters appear from nowhere? The laughter that began a year earlier is gone. All that remains is a new word whispered in mess halls across the Pacific. Lightning. By late 1943, the laughter over Rabaul had turned to silence. Every Zero pilot in the South Pacific now knew the shape of the devil that hunted them. 2 silver tails flashing in the sunlight, a streak too fast to fight and too heavy to ignore. Japanese command tried to adapt, sending up new variants of the Zero with clipped wings and larger engines. But it made no difference. The Lightning owned the thin air above 25,000 feet, and below that it could dive out of reach before a single cannon round connected. American squadrons learned to play altitude like a drum. They would loiter high, engines whispering, invisible against the blue until radar or radio spotted a formation below. Then they fell, 2,000 horsepower from each engine driving those big Curtiss props until the tips went supersonic, 4.5 zero-caliber guns and a single 20-millimeter cannon firing dead center from the nose. No convergence, no guessing. When the P-38 pulled the trigger, every bullet went where the pilot looked. The Japanese called it Bakuha no Oni, the demon of explosions. American pilots just called it work. By the end of 1943, the Lightning had become the backbone of Allied air power in the South Pacific. Long range, long legs, and twin engines meant it could do what no other fighter could: escort bombers across oceans. A P-40 or a Spitfire might guard a raid for 100 miles. The P-38 could stay for 600. That range changed everything. Japanese bases, once safe behind thousands of miles of water, were suddenly exposed. The empire that had expanded faster than it could defend now found American fighters striking deep against Rabaul, Wewak, and Truk. Everywhere the Lightnings went, supply lines snapped. For Japanese pilots, the psychological shift was devastating. They had grown up believing the Zero was invincible, its agility divine. Now, they were being shot down by something they could barely see before it killed them. The myth cracked. Fear seeped in. In January 1944, Captain Richard Bong of Wisconsin reached 25 kills. His wingman joked that he fought like a farmer, steady, patient, efficient. Bong didn't chase. He calculated. He'd climb above the fight, wait, then drop through it like a falling star. 2-second burst, one less enemy, then he'd climb again, invisible, untouchable. Reporters loved him. The brass hated that he kept buzzing headquarters in celebration. His response: "If I could dive that low on a Zero, you'd give me another medal." Behind the humor was precision. Bong and others like him, Tommy McGuire, Jay Robbins, Gerald Johnson, were teaching the world that air combat was no longer about who turned tighter. It was about who struck first and left nothing standing. Meanwhile, the engineers back home were making the Lightning meaner. The P-38J arrived with chin radiators that solved overheating, stronger engines that pushed it past 420 miles per hour, and improved compressibility flaps that let it dive faster without shaking itself apart. Now, the Pacific had a true long-range killer. By summer, the Japanese were reporting entire bomber raids that never lost a single plane. Every Zero that tried to intercept simply vanished. The once proud aces who had conquered China and the Philippines now flew with rookie replacements, kids with 50 hours of flight time, against Americans who had logged 400. The results were inevitable. October 1944, the Philippines. The empire is collapsing, and the Lightnings are everywhere. They lead the invasion convoys, strafe ships, destroy fuel dumps, and chase every speck of movement that dares rise into the air. General MacArthur himself lands at Leyte under their cover. The Japanese pilots watching from the mountains can't believe what they see. American fighters ranging freely where Japanese bombers once reigned. The sky that used to belong to the rising sun now belongs to twin tails and turbochargers. When the Japanese Army Air Force launches its desperate kamikaze campaign, the Lightnings are the first to intercept. Their pilots watch, stunned, as opponents ram into ships rather than fight back. It's no longer a contest. It's a collapse. The legend of the fork-tailed devil spreads across the Pacific like a campfire story. Infantrymen hear it from sailors hear it from gunners, and even prisoners whisper about it in the dark. The Lightning isn't just a machine anymore. It's a symbol that the tide has turned for good. Captured diaries tell the same story. One Japanese pilot wrote, "We thought the Americans could not build good fighters. Now their twin-engine one kills us before we can even begin the turn. I saw my leader explode without warning. I think that is the devil's plane. But the devil had limits. Flying 6-hour missions across endless water. Broke both man and machine. Engines seized. Fuel gauges lied. Storms swallowed aircraft whole. Pilots landed on jungle strips half-conscious, shaking from exhaustion and heat. The Lightning could take punishment, but not loneliness. Ground crews became magicians, replacing engines in mud, welding bullet holes with chewing gum and hope. They joked that the plane didn't need oil, just coffee and stubbornness. And yet, it kept flying day after day, until the rising sun itself began to set. By 1944, the P-38 had become more than a weapon. It was an ecosystem of American logistics stretched across the Pacific. Every mission depended on a miracle of coordination. Tankers delivering fuel to coral airstrips, barges unloading ammunition in the surf, and mechanics sweating under canvas to keep those twin Allisons breathing. Pilots joked that the plane was part fighter, part bomber, part submarine. It could do everything except make coffee. But for the Japanese, it was a nightmare with propellers. The Zero had once ruled the skies with elegance and precision, dancing in tight spirals, making kills look effortless. Against the P-38, those dances turned suicidal. The Lightning didn't turn. It lunged. Japanese pilots who tried to outmaneuver it found themselves outgunned, outclimbed, and outranged. Its fire came from the nose, straight and stable, 4.50 cals, and a 20-millimeter cannon sending molten metal in a perfect beam. One burst could erase a plane from existence. Survivors said it felt like being hit by a wall. The Japanese began calling them two-tailed dragons. In the Philippines, entire formations disappeared before they could even reach their targets. The sky filled with silver streaks, the roar of twin engines merging into one thunderous note that echoed through the mountains. When a Lightning dived, its prop tips went supersonic, a sound Japanese ground crews learned to fear long before the first explosion. The sound meant the hunt was on. By early 1945, the Lightnings were executing surgical strikes deep into the Empire's heart. Pilots like Thomas McGuire, Charles Lindbergh, and Richard Bong were rewriting what fighter range meant. Bong ended the war with 40 confirmed kills, everyone made from the cockpit of a Lightning. McGuire, his friendly rival, wasn't far behind. They pushed the plane to its limits, learning that with enough altitude and nerve, it could outdive any propeller plane ever built. Japanese pilots stopped trying to dogfight them. Instead, they tried ambushes, climbing in the sun's glare to strike unseen. But the Lightnings flew higher than anything Japan could field. The turbo superchargers gave them lungs above 30,000 feet, where Zeros gasped and engines wheezed. It wasn't just power, it was evolution. The Lightning belonged to the future. On April 18, 1943, the P-38 proved what range could do when it brought justice from beyond the horizon. Operation Vengeance, a name whispered with reverence, saw a squadron of P-38s fly over 400 miles of open ocean to intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Guided by codebreakers, they arrived within seconds of his plane's ETA. Two Lightnings broke formation, dove through the clouds, and riddled Yamamoto's Betty bomber with fire. It exploded in the jungle below. The mission had been impossible, and yet the Lightning made it look routine. Japan's morale cracked that day, not just because they'd lost their greatest admiral, but because they realized what had killed him wasn't luck or fate. It was reach. America could now strike anywhere, anytime. By war's end, the P-38 had flown 500,000 sorties. It destroyed over 10,000 enemy aircraft, sunk ships, shredded convoys, and escorted bombers from New Guinea to Tokyo. It became the first Allied aircraft to shoot down German jets in Europe and Japanese fighters in the Pacific. A dual theater legend. Pilots loved it, feared it, and respected it like a living thing. The Lightning demanded discipline. It rewarded patience. Treat it rough, and it would kill you. Respect it, and it would carry you home on one engine, leaking oil, riddled with holes, wings trembling but alive. When peace finally came, the survivors gathered on tarmacs across the Pacific, engines cooling, the air thick with silence. The twin tails glinted in the sunlight one last time. Mechanics leaned against them, exhausted. Pilots lit cigarettes, watching smoke curl upward into the same blue sky where they'd once hunted. The P-38 had been mocked by Japanese pilots as heavy, clumsy, unworthy of combat. In the end, it had turned those jokes into funerals. It hunted them from the clouds, from the edges of the radar, from places they never expected a fighter to reach. It was the sound of two engines roaring over an empire that thought itself untouchable, the metallic thunder that announced a new era of air power. The Lightning didn't just win battles. It rewrote the laws of distance, speed, and survival. The last laugh belonged to the twin-tailed devil, echoing over empty runways long after the war was done. Even after the war ended, the legend of the Lightning didn't fade. It evolved. When the Pacific quieted and the thunder ceased, the aircraft that had once struck fear into the hearts of Zero pilots became the symbol of how America had fought its war, with reach, precision, and impossible ambition. Veterans who had flown it couldn't quite let go. They described it like a living partner, temperamental, unforgiving, but loyal beyond reason. "You didn't just fly a P-38, one pilot said. You entered a pact with it. It could climb like a homesick angel and dive like a meteor, and yet, when it was wounded, it refused to die." Dozens of Lightnings came home missing parts of wings, tails, engines completely blown off. One even flew 150 miles on a single prop, half its tail gone, the pilot soaked in oil and sweat, but alive. The Japanese airmen, who once mocked it as slow and clumsy, left behind diaries filled with awe and bitterness. "The twin-tailed monster cannot be escaped," wrote Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka, whose squadron lost 5 zeros in under 3 minutes near Rabaul. "We shoot and shoot, but it comes through the smoke like something born of fire." Those words became the unofficial obituary of Japan's air supremacy. For years, the Zero had ruled the Pacific with grace and maneuverability. Then the Lightning appeared, faster, higher, tougher, and erased that rule. It didn't fight like a man. It hunted like a machine. As the Allies pushed toward Japan, the P-38 became a flying scalpel, cutting apart the Empire's supply lines, one convoy, one base, one island at a time. In the Philippines, it prowled volcanic skies. Over the Solomon Islands, it struck airfields before dawn, its guns leaving ribbons of tracer fire that looked like lightning bolts. The nickname wasn't just poetic. Pilots flying below described those twin engines flashing through clouds and thought the gods themselves were at war. Every major Japanese ace of 1942 was gone by 1944. Most shot down by Lightnings or Mustangs trained under Lightning doctrine. Its technological genius was ahead of its time. Counter-rotating props, turbochargers, armor shielding, all integrated into an airframe that looked more spaceship than airplane. Mechanics said maintaining a Lightning was like wrenching on the future. Pilots who transitioned from P-40s or Spitfires needed weeks just to understand its systems. But once they did, they were untouchable. They could fly from New Guinea to the Philippines, fight for 20 minutes, and return without refueling, something no other fighter on Earth could do. That endurance made it the perfect assassin in a war fought across an ocean the size of the moon. By 1945, Japanese commanders dreaded a particular sound, the deep symmetrical rumble of twin Allisons approaching from beyond visual range. Every man in a control tower, every pilot strapping into a Zero, every gunner staring at the horizon, knew what that sound meant. Death was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. When the Lightnings appeared, they didn't swoop or glide. They descended like judgment itself, guns flashing, engines howling, tearing through squadrons in seconds. And just as quickly they were gone, vanishing into the sky that had always belonged to them. When Tokyo finally surrendered, the surviving Japanese pilots spoke of the P-38 with an almost religious dread. Some compared it to a mythic beast, others simply called it the Sky Demon. For them, it represented the moment their mastery of the air had ended forever. The Lightning had not only beaten them in combat, it had exposed the limits of everything they believed about courage, discipline, and the art of flying. It was technology raised to the level of inevitability. Years later, when restored P-38s flew again at air shows, older Japanese veterans would sometimes stand silently at the fence line, eyes glistening as that unmistakable roar returned. They weren't hearing engines. They were hearing memory, the sound of an empire falling from the sky, hunted and destroyed by the machine they once laughed at. The lightning had outlived them all. It was more than a plane. It was the moment the modern world announced itself, twin tails cutting across the horizon like a signature written in smoke. America had arrived, and it would never again be underestimated. In the aftermath of the war, the P-38 Lightning didn't retire quietly. It became the blueprint for an era. The twin-boom silhouette that once haunted the Pacific inspired nearly every jet design that followed. Engineers studying its performance realized it had been decades ahead of its time. Its aerodynamics predicted the jet age before jets even ruled the sky. The Allison engines had been pushed to the brink of mechanical possibility, and their turbo superchargers were lessons in how to bend air and metal to human will. America had used it not just as a fighter, but as a messenger, proof that ingenuity, built at scale, could crush myth and mystique alike. Japanese engineers, when shown captured lightnings at war's end, walked around them in silence. They examined the wiring looms, the control systems, the redundancy of everything from hydraulics to oxygen. And one of them finally whispered, "This is not a fighter. It is a civilization." In every theater, the Lightning had rewritten expectations. In the Aleutians, it shrugged off ice and wind that froze other aircraft solid. Over Italy, it hunted German trains and trucks in the valleys until the Wehrmacht began painting fake roads just to survive. In Burma, it became a photo recon legend, its cameras mapping jungles no human had ever crossed. The same plane that had shredded Zeros was also quietly taking the first images that would guide the post-war world into reconstruction. And always, the crews said the same thing. It just kept going, no matter how far, no matter how damaged. Pilots bailed out of burning Lightnings and watched them glide for miles before crashing. As if even dying, the plane refused to fall without dignity. The Lightning spirit carried beyond the war itself. Its pilots came home changed, men who had flown through thunderclouds at full power, through tracer storms over the Philippines, through the bright silence of dawn raids over Rabaul. Many couldn't adjust to the quiet. Some became airline captains, others test pilots for the new jets that were already replacing their old mounts. But each of them remembered the feeling of those twin engines in perfect sync, the vibration running through the control stick like a living pulse. They spoke of the P-38 not as a machine, but as a presence. "You could feel it thinking," one said. "It knew when you were scared. It carried you anyway." In Japan, the memory of those hunts never left. Surviving airmen taught post-war cadets what the Lightning had done, not in bitterness, but as a warning about underestimating an enemy's imagination. In every story, there was a moment of disbelief, a pilot seeing a silver glint far away, realizing it wasn't a bomber or a cloud, but death itself closing the distance at 400 miles an hour. The Lightning's reputation became folklore. Children of Japanese veterans would hear about the two-tailed shadow, the aircraft that came from the horizon and disappeared into the sun. To them, it was less a weapon and more a phantom, a symbol of the sky's betrayal. And yet, there was a strange respect, too. Japanese designers studying captured P-38s borrowed lessons that would reappear in post-war jet fighters. Aerodynamic data from the Lightning directly influenced the first generation of Japanese civil aviation. In a quiet irony, the plane that had once destroyed Japan's Air Force helped teach it to fly again. Meanwhile, in America, the Lightning became the stuff of nostalgia and national pride. Air shows featured it roaring past grandstands, its props screaming with that deep, symmetrical tone that no other fighter could replicate. Kids pointed upward as the old men in the crowd smiled because they knew what that sound once meant. The P-38 Lightning had begun its life as a controversial design mocked even by its own test pilots. But it ended its story as one of the most dominant aircraft ever built. It had fought on both ends of the Earth, hunted everything that flew for the Axis, and proven that innovation could be as lethal as courage. For Japanese pilots, its arrival had been the beginning of the end. For American ones, it was the beginning of modern air power. It bridged worlds, the piston and the jet, the individual ace and the industrial war machine. And when the last Lightning lifted off into the sunset, its twin tails casting long shadows on the tarmac, it carried with it the echo of every battle where laughter turned to silence and silence turned to awe. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was legend forged in aluminum and smoke. Decades after the last P-38 had rolled out of Lockheed's factory in Burbank, mechanics who had worked on them still described the aircraft as something almost alive. "You didn't maintain it," one said. "You kept up with it." The twin Allison engines had personalities of their own, one always running a few degrees hotter, the other humming smoother on climb, but together they made a harmony no single-engine aircraft could match. The Lightning could smell weather before pilots saw it, sense air pressure shifts, and ride turbulence like a surfer on an invisible wave. In those years when Japan still struggled to rebuild, villagers near old airfields would swear that on certain nights they heard it again, the double hum, the faint metallic thunder fading toward the horizon. Superstition, maybe, but the memory of that sound had burned itself into the Pacific air. In the United States, engineers dissected the Lightning's secrets to birth the jet age. The twin-boom layout influenced everything from the F-80 to the U-2. Kelly Johnson, who had led its design as a young man, became the father of the Skunk Works, creating the SR-71 and the F-104, each one carrying a little of the Lightning's DNA. The cockpit ergonomics, the control linkages, even the way its hydraulic flaps responded under stress were copied and refined. Test pilots in the late 40s flew captured P-38s to learn what compressibility really meant. The terrifying moment when air thickened around the wings and control froze. Those studies became the foundation of supersonic flight. In a way, every jet that broke the sound barrier owed its first whisper to that prop-driven, twin-tailed monster. But for the men who had flown it in war, the memory wasn't academic. It was personal. They remembered the smell of hot oil at dawn, the weight of the helmet against the headrest, the way the plane trembled as the turbos wound up. They remembered the first time they saw tracers arcing toward them like molten beads, and how the Lightning just took it, shrugged off damage, and clawed back into the sky. They remembered chasing Zeros over the sea, watching sunlight flash off enemy canopies before their guns turned that brilliance into falling fire. For them, every victory was paid for in noise, sweat, and faith in that impossible machine. And in Japan, there were ghosts of another kind. Many young pilots who had mocked the P-38 never came home, but their surviving comrades carried stories that blurred the line between fact and legend. Some said the Lightning could appear out of cloud where no aircraft should have been able to fly, dive vertically, then climb away without stalling. Others swore they had seen it continue fighting after one engine exploded. They called it Rajan's Wing, after the Thunder God, half in jest, half in reverence. To them, it was a reminder that industrial might and relentless innovation could eclipse the pure spirit of a warrior. By the 1960s, the remaining P-38s sat forgotten in hangars or rusting in Pacific jungles, their aluminum skins turning dull gray. Then a new generation of restorers found them. They dragged wrecks out of the mud, rebuilt engines from spare parts, polished the twin booms until they gleamed like mirrors. When one flew again, the sound shook the airfields of California like history itself clearing its throat. Reporters described the return of the Lightning as time travel with propellers. Old veterans came to see, some using canes, some in wheelchairs. When the twin Allisons started, a few men cried openly. They said it was like hearing an old friend breathe again. At an air show in Oshkosh, a Japanese visitor, once a pilot trainee in 1945, stood beside an American ace who had flown P-38s out of New Guinea. For a long moment, they just watched the aircraft taxi past, silver under the sun, twin tails slicing the air. Finally, the Japanese man said softly, "I used to dream of outrunning that sound." The American looked at him and nodded. Nobody ever did. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth. The lightning was proof that the future always belongs to those who dare to overbuild, overthink, and outimagine the enemy. It was heavy, complicated, expensive, everything doctrine warned against, and yet it dominated precisely because it broke the rules. It turned raw horsepower into altitude, engineering into survival, and mockery into myth. The Japanese had laughed at it once. The laughter ended somewhere over the Pacific, buried under the roar of twin engines and 8 guns that spoke in lightning. Even now, when a restored P-38 lifts off and arcs toward the clouds, that old feeling returns. The earth trembles a little. The air vibrates. People look up instinctively, sensing the approach of something vast and inevitable. For a heartbeat, time folds back to 1943, to the endless blue sky, to the hunters and the hunted, to the moment when the world learned that innovation could make even thunder obey. The twin-tailed demon climbs, engines harmonized, sunlight flashing off polished wings. It keeps climbing until it's a glint, then nothing but sound fading into memory. That is the legacy of the P-38 Lightning, the machine that Japan laughed at until the sky itself joined in the laughter, and the echo became history. The Lightning's shadow stretched far beyond its lifetime, echoing through every warplane that came after it. Engineers who grew up hearing stories of the twin-boomed killer carried its ghost into every blueprint they drew. The symmetrical power, the balance, the redundancy. It was the gospel of aviation safety and lethality rolled into one. In Cold War briefings, American strategists still used it as shorthand. Build it like a P-38. That meant make it durable enough to take hits, simple enough to fix in the field, and terrifying enough that the enemy would know what was coming long before it appeared on radar. In post-war Japan, airfields that once echoed with Zeros were soon roaring again, this time with jets built in partnership with the same nation that had once hunted them. Lockheed engineers stood beside Japanese apprentices, teaching them about airflow, torque, and structural stress. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same company that had designed the Lightning was now helping Japan rise from its ashes, this time not with wings of war, but with the wings of industry. In a strange, poetic circle, the plane that had destroyed Japan's air power was now the ancestor of its rebirth. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America's young pilots still read about it in training manuals, a piece of history they could touch. The flight instructors who'd once been boys during the war told stories of the Lightning like campfire legends. They described how it could outdive anything, how its pilots learned to fight using physics instead of flair, how it was the first plane to teach humanity that altitude wasn't just a number, it was power. Those lessons bled straight into the jet era. The F-15's doctrine of energy fighting was born the moment a P-38 pilot realized he could dive, zoom, and kill without ever turning. Museums preserved them as artifacts, but restorers treated them like sacred relics. The Lightning wasn't just aluminum and rivets. It was proof that America had once built machines with soul. Its surfaces were a collage of scars and repairs, bullet patches hammered smooth and painted over, 1,000 ghosts of combat embedded in every panel. When modern aviators walked around one, they could still see the story written in metal, the burns from tracer rounds, the dents from shrapnel, the uneven welds from rushed wartime production. Each imperfection told a story of survival, a mechanical memory of pilots who had trusted their lives to it. There's an old saying among airmen, the airplane knows who you are. The Lightning did. It rewarded courage, but punished arrogance. It could forgive a mistake, but never laziness. If you flew it half-heartedly, it would buck you, stall you, or shake itself apart. But if you treated it with respect, if you listened to the hum of its engines, felt the subtle shift of pressure on the controls, it would become an extension of your body, almost telepathic. Pilots swore that in the Lightning they didn't just fly, they belonged to the sky. And in that sky, somewhere over endless ocean, echoes of its hunts still linger. The Japanese veterans who lived long enough to see peace would sometimes hear that sound in dreams. The twin thunder approaching, the flash of sunlight on silver wings, the trail of smoke cutting through the blue. Some awoke drenched in sweat. Others smiled faintly, remembering the beauty of an opponent that had earned their respect. Because the Lightning didn't just kill, it converted. It turned enemies into witnesses of progress. When one of the last surviving P-38s took off from Chino in the early 2000s, people drove from hundreds of miles away just to see it fly. The crowd fell silent as the engine spooled up, then roared. The plane lifted gracefully, twin tails gleaming like a forked spear. For a few seconds, it seemed to hang there, defying gravity as it always had. And when it banked and dove, the sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder from another age. Children covered their ears. Veterans covered their hearts. The Lightning circled once, twice, then climbed until it was a silver cross in the sun. It wasn't just flying, it was remembering. Somewhere deep inside that roar was every pilot it had ever carried. Every battle. Every scream of a Zero breaking apart under those guns. Every gasp of a mechanic watching his squadron's last hope take off one more time. The Lightning was gone, but not dead. You can still hear it in the heartbeat of every jet that takes off today, in the way modern engines spool into a growl before launch, in the confidence of every pilot who trusts his machine completely. It was the aircraft that made laughter die in the throats of its enemies, and pride rise in the hearts of its makers. The Japanese pilots mocked it once, but the sky remembered who laughed first and who flew last. Because the Lightning didn't just dominate a war, it defined an era. Its engines may be silent now, but its echo still lives in every sky mankind dares to conquer. And as the decades stretched on, the P-38 turned from a machine of war into something almost mythical. A story older pilots told to remind the young what built different really meant. It wasn't romanticized heroism. It was respect for pure engineering willpower. 2 engines, 2 tails, and 1 purpose: survive, strike, return. Pilots who had flown jets later in life often said they'd never again felt that same connection. Jets are clean, one veteran explained, but the Lightning was alive. It roared, it fought you, it saved you, it made you earn the sky. When historians tried to chart why the Lightning became so feared, they kept coming back to the same 3 words: altitude, endurance, and audacity. It could climb higher than anything the Japanese had, fight twice as long, and turn what was once a defensive patrol into a hunt that stretched hundreds of miles. Its pilots learned to read the sky like mathematicians, measuring the enemy's energy, converting height into speed, and speed back into height, always dictating the fight. The Japanese, trained on close-quarters turning duels, never adapted. The P-38 didn't duel. It decided. Back home, Lockheed's factory workers knew it too. They worked under blackout curtains, thousands of them. Women in overalls, men too old for the front, building these twin-engine creatures with the precision of watchmakers. They'd sign their names on panels hidden under the cockpit, a silent message to the pilot who'd trust their work. Bring it home safe, one scrawled on a piece of aluminum later found in a wreck in New Guinea. That connection between factory and front line was part of the Lightning's strength. Every rivet was personal. Every engine was built like a prayer. By the 1970s, as jet technology soared past anything the war generation could have imagined, aviation museums began rescuing Lightnings from jungles and scrapyards. Each restoration became a resurrection. Some planes came back with original bullet holes still patched with wartime steel, polished smooth but left visible. A badge of honor. Test flights of these restored machines drew crowds bigger than sports arenas. When the pilots throttled up those twin Allisons, people didn't just watch. They felt it in their chests. The vibration was memory made physical. And still, across the Pacific, fragments of wrecked Lightnings lie buried under vines and coral. Locals treat them like sacred relics. Divers off the coast of Papua New Guinea found one resting upright on the ocean floor, canopy open. Instruments frozen at cruising altitude. No body, just the ghost of a machine that refused to crash with dignity. In the stillness, the metal hasn't rusted completely. The ocean preserves it like a time capsule of courage. What made the Lightning different wasn't just its performance. It was the mindset behind it. It was America saying, "We'll build something so outrageous it shouldn't work, and then make it unstoppable." It was proof that progress doesn't ask for permission. When Lockheed rolled out the first prototype, even their own engineers were skeptical. Yet, when the engines roared and that strange double-tailed beast lifted clean off the runway, they all knew the future had just arrived. For Japan, that future came screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. By the time they realized what it was, the world had already changed. The empire that once prided itself on spiritual strength learned that innovation could be a kind of faith too, one measured in octane, horsepower, and industrial will. Even now, every time a Lightning starts up, there's a kind of reverence in the air. The crowd doesn't cheer immediately. They wait, because that first rumble isn't just sound, it's history waking up. Then, when the throttles open and the twin props blur into silver discs, the ground shakes, hearts race, and, for a few seconds, everyone understands what it must have felt like to be on some distant Pacific island in 1944, looking up in fear or awe as the two-tailed demon came hunting through the clouds. That's the legacy the Japanese never forgot and Americans never stopped honoring, that audacity beats fear, that design can be destiny, and that laughter, when aimed at genius, never lasts long. The Lightning still flies, and every time it does, it reminds the world that in the battle between mockery and mastery, the sky always sides with the bold. The legend of the Lightning grew louder with every retelling, not because of nostalgia, but because the numbers never lied. No other Allied fighter destroyed more Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. No other American plane combined range, firepower, and speed so completely. It was the scalpel and the hammer of the war. Its pilots flew missions that stretched over 1,000 miles of open ocean, the kind of distance that would have been suicide for any single-engine plane. But the P-38 could go where logic said it couldn't. It didn't need an escort. It was the escort, the strike team, and the rescue unit all in one. Each time those twin Allisons started up, they didn't just turn propellers, they turned fate. In 1944, a Japanese reconnaissance report described the P-38 as the most troublesome enemy machine. That was the polite version. The unspoken truth among Japanese pilots was simpler. If you saw a Lightning above you, you didn't live long enough to see it again. At high altitude, the turbochargers howled like banshees, the exhaust glowing orange against the sky. Below, the twin tails flashed like mirrored blades. The Japanese tried ambush tactics, diving from the sun or hiding in cloud layers, but the P-38 was too fast, too patient, too calculating. It climbed past the ambush, turned inside physics itself, and came back down like a meteor. The last thing many Zero pilots ever saw were 8 points of light, 4.50 cals, and a 20mm cannon speaking in the language of inevitability. The Lightning's genius wasn't only in its weapons, it was in how it changed the way wars were fought. For the first time, a fighter could cover bombers, dogfight interceptors, and strafe ground targets without ever refueling. It could fly from Australia to the Philippines, fire its guns, and come back with fuel to spare. When the Army Air Forces realized what they had, they stopped thinking of the Pacific as a series of isolated islands and started seeing it as one connected battlefield. The P-38 turned the map inside out. Japanese intelligence couldn't comprehend how such a large aircraft could outperform their nimble Zeros. They believed it had to be two smaller planes flying in perfect formation until they recovered wreckage. What they found made no sense. An airframe built like a fortress, armored plates everywhere, control systems doubled and tripled for redundancy, and engines that looked like they'd been forged for a bomber. "This is not a fighter," one Japanese engineer muttered. "It is an empire in metal." He wasn't wrong. Pilots said the Lightning had moods. On takeoff, it felt heavy, stubborn, like a bull waiting for the matador to flinch first. But once airborne, it transformed. The weight melted away, and the whole plane seemed to balance on a fingertip. Veteran ace Richard Bong described it as riding thunder with a steering wheel. It could roll at 400 miles an hour, dive at 500, and climb like a homesick angel. When it accelerated, the vibration hit you through the seat, not shaking but pulsing like a heartbeat. You didn't command the Lightning, you joined it. To the Japanese, that symphony of sound was terror itself. 2 engines meant 2 chances to kill it, but neither chance ever worked. Many Zeros were armed with only 2 7.7mm machine guns and a single 20mm cannon, lethal against cloth and wood planes of the 1930s, almost useless against the armored juggernaut from Lockheed. There are combat reports where Japanese pilots fired full bursts into P-38s and watched, stunned, as the American fighters shrugged off the damage, rolled, and blasted back with overwhelming force. It was a new kind of fight, mechanical superiority against human daring, and the machines were winning. What truly broke Japan's confidence was the Lightning's ability to strike at will. The Yamamoto interception, that surgical 400-mile strike through tropical storms, guided only by dead reckoning, proved that nowhere was safe. The death of the architect of Pearl Harbor wasn't just vengeance. It was a signal that America could now reach across oceans and kill with precision. Every Japanese pilot who read the report felt it like a punch to the stomach. Their empire, once defined by range and initiative, now had to look over its shoulder. The hunters had become the hunted. And yet, for all its brutality, there was artistry in how the Lightning flew. It was graceful in motion, 2 streams of exhaust painting curls of smoke across the sky, the twin tails slicing through sunlight like silver tuning forks. When you saw a formation of P-38s banking in unison, it didn't look like war. It looked like choreography, but the beauty was deceptive. Every arc, every roll, every climb was calibrated with mathematical precision to maximize firing windows and energy advantage. The Lightning turned air combat into geometry. On the ground, Japanese troops learned to fear the whistle of death. The P-38's dive created a distinct sound, a high-pitched howl as air tore through its turbo ducts. That sound meant the sky was about to fall. Trucks, trains, and ships caught under a Lightning's guns never stood a chance. Its strafing runs were surgical. A single pass could shred a convoy, ignite fuel depots, or slice through wooden bridges like paper. Photos from reconnaissance runs showed battlefields littered with perfect rows of destruction, as if drawn by a ruler. Mechanics who maintained them became obsessed. Each Lightning had its quirks. One engine ran hotter, another always leaked oil, Another vibrated just slightly off rhythm. But every mechanic swore their plane had a soul. They named them like pets: Jap Bat Killer, Wicked Wanda, Glacier Gal. When a Lightning didn't return from a mission, ground crews didn't just lose a machine, they lost a friend. And still, the Japanese pilots tried. They adapted, forming wolf packs of Zeros to swarm a single Lightning. But the math was against them. The P-38's firepower, concentrated in its nose rather than its wings, made it stable and devastating. Its bullets didn't cross. They converged into a single stream of annihilation. When one hit landed, 10 followed. Pilots described watching enemy planes simply dissolve, the tail separating from the fuselage in a bloom of smoke and fragments. No dogfight could survive that. The psychological shift was immense. By late 1944, intercepted Japanese radio traffic was filled with fear and confusion. Two tails became code for immediate disengagement. Squadrons once proud of their dominance now avoided combat above 20,000 feet. American pilots could hear the panic in the chatter, and they used it. They'd climb high, wait for the enemy to flinch, and then dive. Every engagement was over in seconds. The Lightning didn't fight long battles. It ended them. Its success wasn't magic. It was industrial arithmetic. Lockheed's production lines ran day and night, turning out thousands of airframes, each built with wartime urgency but peacetime precision. Factories tested every component to failure before shipping. Engines were fired up on stands until their pistons glowed red, then rebuilt and sent out again. The scale of it all dwarfed anything Japan could match. The Empire was still crafting planes by hand, while America was building them like clockwork. Even the pilots' training programs reflected this machine-first philosophy. Lightning pilots weren't just taught to fly, they were taught to think like engineers. They learned airflow, stress loads, compression limits, things most fighter jocks ignored. They knew exactly how far they could push the engines before the turbos overheated. How to nurse one dead engine home over open water. How to trim the plane for level flight with bullet holes the size of fists. Knowledge became armor, and the Lightning gave them time to use it. When peace finally came, and the Empire surrendered, those who had fought against the P-38 carried its ghost with them. In interviews years later, former Japanese pilots spoke of it not with hatred but with a kind of awe. One said, "We thought it unfair. It was not a plane. It was a storm." Another admitted, "The sound of its engines still makes me shiver." When you heard both, you knew you were already dead. Lockheed's engineers, too, couldn't quite let it go. The Lightning had taught them things they hadn't known they were capable of, lessons in airflow, metallurgy, and human endurance that shaped everything that followed. The U-2, the SR-71, even NASA's X-planes all carried fragments of the Lightning's DNA. The twin-boom design itself became a symbol of balance, of how brute force could coexist with elegance. Today, only a handful of Lightnings remain airworthy. They appear at air shows like ghosts from a parallel world. When their engines start, the crowd feels that old hum, the perfect synchronization of two 1,600 horsepower hearts beating as one. Children cover their ears. Veterans close their eyes, and for just a few seconds the past becomes present again. There's no moralizing in the Lightning's legacy. It wasn't built to represent good or evil. It represented capability. It was proof that imagination, when industrialized, becomes unstoppable. The Japanese pilots mocked it once, laughed at its bulk, its twin tails, its ungraceful lines. But in the end, those same features became the instruments of their destruction. The P-38 didn't win through beauty or luck. It won because it dared to be different. Some machines live in museums. Others live in memory. The Lightning lives in both. Eternal, untouchable, still climbing somewhere in that endless Pacific sky. The P-38's myth, never really stopped growing. It just changed shape as the world it helped create kept evolving. Jet pilots who never fought a day in the Pacific still mentioned it in bars and classrooms, as if they'd known it personally. "If you want to understand what makes a warplane immortal," one instructor said, "find a P-38 and stand close when it starts. You'll feel the answer before you hear it." The Lightning had a voice that didn't just fill air, it seemed to rearrange it. Two engines speaking the same sentence in perfect rhythm. Even in the 21st century, audio engineers recording surviving aircraft found that its sound pattern was closer to a musical chord than a noise. Aviation museums discovered that crowds stayed longer in the P-38 hangar than anywhere else. Visitors didn't always know why. They'd just stand under the wings and look up, tracing the twin tails like cathedral arches. Kids would run fingers along the skin, expecting to feel rough patches from bullet holes. And docents would tell them, "Every one of those dimples is a story that made it home." In Chino, California, restorers still wipe fingerprints off the same panel that once took cannon fire over Rabaul. "You can smell history in the oil," they say. By the 1980s, a generation that had never known war rediscovered the Lightning in documentaries and dogfight footage. Grainy film showed them things that didn't seem real: metal birds, carving spirals in the clouds, tracers slicing through the sky like molten threads, planes returning with half their tails missing. But the most surreal part was the faces. Young men barely 20, grinning behind oxygen masks, eyes bloodshot, alive on a scale only possible in war. The Lightning gave them something no ground battle ever could: a front row seat to the gods. Japanese veterans who attended peace ceremonies in the Pacific spoke of it differently now. They called it the Great Teacher, not because it taught mercy, but because it taught humility. Their entire strategy had been built on elegance, discipline, and agility. The Lightning shattered that philosophy with physics and persistence. It proved that power itself could be graceful, that endurance could be a kind of artistry. One aging Zero pilot admitted in a 1987 interview, "We built airplanes for samurai. America built airplanes for the future. The future won." When the Smithsonian restored Glacier Girl, a P-38 rescued from under 250 feet of Greenland ice, the event became global news. Pulled from its frozen tomb after 50 years, it was reassembled bolt by bolt, like resurrecting a myth. When its engines finally fired, people cried, not from patriotism, but from the shock of realizing something designed to destroy could still be so beautiful. The airplane climbed into the sky like time itself reversing course. Even the sound was the same. The harmonized thunder that once meant war now meant wonder. And yet the legacy wasn't only nostalgia. Every modern stealth or reconnaissance design still borrows lessons from the Lightning. The twin boom structure, the separated engines, the aerodynamic purity, it all began there. Even the concept of modularity, the idea that parts could be swapped and serviced anywhere in the world, came from Lockheed's 1940s obsession with keeping P-38s flying on jungle airstrips. It was a warplane built for a war that hadn't been imagined yet. Inside hangars where mechanics still tune its engines, there's a ritual silence before startup. They prime the fuel, check the mags, clear the props, and everyone steps back. The starter coughs once, twice, and then the first Allison catches. The second follows a half-second later, syncing like twin heartbeats. The ground shakes. Conversations stop. For that moment, the air belongs to another century. You can almost see the silhouettes of ground crews in faded uniforms, hands shielding their faces from the blast of prop wash. People always ask, why does the Lightning still matter? It's because it marked the moment humanity outgrew its fear of scale. Before it, fighters were small, fragile things that relied on agility. The P-38 said no. It said you could be big, armored, overpowered, and still fly like poetry. It was a philosophy disguised as a machine, the belief that boldness beats balance, that invention beats imitation. Every time a Lightning took off, it proved that being underestimated was its favorite weapon. For the Japanese, that underestimation became tragedy. The first time they saw it, they laughed. The last time they saw it, it was the shape of defeat descending from a blinding sun. And for America, it was the moment they realized technology could carry ideology farther than any speech. The twin-tailed devil became a mirror of the country that built it, loud, confident, unstoppable when provoked, and capable of compassion after victory. Now, in the quiet between modern flyovers, when a restored P-38 slices across the sky at an air show, the crowd still feels that same mix of awe and disbelief. It shouldn't exist anymore. It shouldn't fly that fast, or climb that steep, or look that futuristic. But it does. And somewhere deep down, even those who don't know its story understand that they're watching the ghost of the moment, when laughter turned to silence, when the world learned that the sky itself could have a memory. Some say the Lightning's story ended in 1945, when its last combat patrols faded into the Pacific sunset. But that's a lie. Machines like this don't die. They just change forms, quietly seeding their DNA into everything that comes after. Every F-22, every F-35, every drone orbiting unseen above a battlefield carries a flicker of that same electric genius that first hummed through the P-38's twin booms. It was the moment humanity learned to turn engineering into instinct. Lockheed engineers didn't just build an aircraft, they built an attitude. 2 engines, 2 tails, no apologies. Even in peace, the Lightning never lost its edge. Pilots who flew it said it spoiled them forever. Nothing else felt as alive, as eager to go vertical, as willing to dance on the edge of a stall and somehow stay flying. It wasn't a plane, one old-timer said at a reunion in Oshkosh. It was a thought that wanted to climb. And climb it did, to 40,000 feet and beyond, where air thinned and engines screamed, and men found out what courage sounded like. In the Pacific archives, you can still find intercepted Japanese transmissions from 1943, frantic voices describing silver dragons with twin tails that dived faster than anything they'd seen. One pilot shouted, "It's splitting." No, it's one airplane. They couldn't understand the silhouette, the speed, or the gunfire that followed. A few seconds later, static. The Lightning had spoken in a language of lead. But perhaps the strangest part of the P-38's legacy isn't destruction. It's the strange tenderness that followed it. After the war, many Japanese pilots who'd faced Lightnings came to the United States to pay respects at air shows. Some even helped restore captured aircraft. They'd run their hands along the aluminum skin and whisper, "I fought against you." For them, touching it was like shaking hands with fate. The enemy they once feared had become a relic they now admired, proof that even war can produce art. The Lightning's designer, Kelly Johnson, would go on to create the U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird, aircraft so far ahead of their time they still look alien. But he always said the P-38 was his proudest work. "It was the first time we made something that thought for itself," he told interviewers in 1963. 2 engines, 1 pilot, and a brain made of aluminum. The blueprint he left behind. Efficiency through power, beauty through function, became the invisible creed of American aerospace. When they rebuilt Glacier Girl, they found the old wartime pencil markings still on the inside panels. "Tighten all bolts twice. Keep her flying. She'll come back." Those weren't instructions. They were prophecies. And they came true. The same airplane that once slept beneath Arctic ice for half a century rose again, roaring into a world that had long since moved on. But the people watching felt something ancient awaken. That same chill you get when a ghost suddenly remembers your name. Every generation rediscovers the Lightning, and finds a new meaning in it. For the soldiers of the 1940s, it was salvation. For Cold War engineers, it was blueprint. For modern dreamers, it's a symbol, proof that brilliance doesn't need permission. It was built when the odds said no, and flown when the experts said impossible. That's why it endures, because somewhere inside every human heart is a twin-engine defiance that refuses to quit. Today, only a handful of P-38 still fly. But when one passes overhead, conversation stops. The engines growl like thunder, then harmonize into that unmistakable metallic chorus. You don't just hear it, you feel it in your chest, like your pulse sinking to history's heartbeat. Kids stare up, eyes wide. Veterans nod, quietly counting seconds between prop pulses, like old musicians hearing their favorite song. And maybe that's the final truth of the Lightning. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a promise. That courage, when matched with creativity, can rewrite the limits of the sky. That even when mocked, underestimated, or misunderstood, true innovation doesn't argue back. It simply flies higher. So when those Japanese pilots laughed in 1942, calling it the Twin Dragon too heavy to dance, they didn't know they were already hearing the overture to their own defeat. The P-38 didn't just hunt them from the sky. It hunted their certainty. It turned arrogance into silence, myth into metal, fear into respect. And long after the guns fell quiet, the twin tails kept slicing through memory itself. Silver, eternal, unapologetic, reminding the world that once, a machine made of courage and aluminum showed humanity what it meant to truly own the sky. Even now, 80 years later, when a lightning silhouette cuts across the clouds, people instinctively look up, even if they don't know what they're seeing. There's something in its outline that feels wrong for gravity, too symmetrical to be real, like a weapon designed by geometry itself. The twin tails glint, the engines leave twin spirals of vapor, and for a second, it looks less like a relic, and more like a creature that never died, just went quiet until the world was ready again. That feeling, that strange fusion of power and grace, is why it still haunts the imagination. The P-38 wasn't just fast, it was composed. It was a symphony that could destroy. From a distance, it seemed serene, almost gentle. Up close, it was violence with wings. Pilots said flying it felt like driving thunder through silk. You had to respect it. One wrong move and the lightning would bite. But treat it right, and it could do impossible things. Climb like smoke, dive like a falling star, level out before physics could catch up. There's a story from 1944, somewhere over Leyte Gulf, where a P-38 pilot, outnumbered 5-1, refused to run. He throttled down just enough to bait the Zeros, waited until they thought they had him, then slammed both engines forward and rolled inverted into a vertical dive. The Japanese pilots followed. Bad mistake. The Lightning accelerated past 450 miles per hour, too fast for their lighter airframes. 2 Zeros ripped apart in the dive, their wings tearing off. The others tried to pull up and blacked out. The American leveled out at sea level, pulled a hard G-turn, and climbed straight back through the wreckage. He landed with one bullet hole. His mechanic said he looked more exhausted than proud. "You don't win against them," the pilot said. "You just outlast them." That was the Lightning's secret. It wasn't about luck or bravery. It was about endurance. While other fighters danced, the P-38 endured. It fought like an athlete who'd already run 10 miles before stepping into the ring. It could lose a cylinder, an engine, half a wing, and still bring you home. Many did. Photos from island bases show planes with holes big enough to step through, patched with sheet metal, still flying the next day. Ground crews used to joke, "You don't fix a Lightning, you just convince it to keep going." For Japanese engineers who studied captured wrecks, the aircraft was a riddle. It looked bulky but balanced, brutal but efficient. They measured its parts and couldn't understand how it flew so well. The answer was in the math. Perfect symmetry, airflow tuned down to millimeters. Every ounce of drag had been hunted out of its frame. Even the twin tails weren't for style. They reduced stress at high speed. The Lightning wasn't beautiful by accident. It was beautiful because it worked. By the final year of the war, the Japanese command stopped using the term fighter interception when referring to Lightnings. They called them angels of destruction. Radio chatter from the Philippines often broke down into static and panic when twin-engine contacts appeared on radar. Entire convoys changed routes rather than face them. The P-38 had become less an airplane and more an omen, a moving weather system of doom. And yet, there was dignity even in fear. When a Japanese ace was captured and interrogated, he was asked which American fighter he respected most. He didn't hesitate. "The twin-tailed one," he said, because when it came, it didn't rush. It hunted that. Line ended up carved into the base of a memorial years later, not out of irony, but reverence. By the 1950s, as new generations of jets screamed across the sky, the Lightning slipped quietly into legend. But the men who'd flown it carried it in their bones. You could tell a Lightning pilot at reunions by the way his hands moved when he talked, palms curved like yokes, fingers flicking imaginary throttles. They remembered how it smelled inside: hot oil, cordite, ozone, in sweat. They remembered the vibration that started in the seat and climbed into their ribs. They remembered how the canopy glass would fog at altitude and how the world below looked like another planet. They remembered fear, yes, but more than that, they remembered mastery. When the last active P-38 squadrons were retired, airfields felt quieter. Mechanics said it was like losing a heartbeat. Other planes came and went, faster, sleeker, meaner, but none had that presence. None had that duality of machine and myth. The Lightning didn't just dominate the sky, it defined it. There's a story that during a modern flyover, one of the restored Lightnings passed over a group of veterans from both sides, Americans and Japanese alike. The engine's deep twin hum rolled over them, and the crowd fell silent. One Japanese veteran, frail and almost blind, lifted his head and said softly, "Ah, she still flies." No bitterness, no fear, just acknowledgement. A salute from one survivor to another. Maybe that's how legends should end, not with explosions or victory parades, but with understanding. The P-38 Lightning was built to win wars, but it ended up teaching something quieter. That progress, once unleashed, can outlive everything, even hate. The laughter that once greeted its strange twin tails has long since faded. What remains is respect, the kind earned not by beauty or propaganda, but by performance so undeniable it silences everyone who doubted. The Japanese pilots mocked it once. The world mocked it once. Now it stands eternal, a reminder that genius doesn't ask for applause. It simply takes off, climbs, and never comes back down. And somewhere, in every hangar that ever held a Lightning, there's still a presence you can feel before you see. The smell of oil mixed with old aluminum, the echo of tools clanking against steel, the faint vibration through the floor when an engine test starts. It's not nostalgia. It's something alive. When a P-38 starts up after months of silence, the air shifts. The twin Allisons cough, catch, then settle into that perfect counter rhythm, like two drummers finding the same heartbeat. Everyone nearby stops pretending to talk. They know they're standing in the shadow of a ghost that refuses to rest. Restorers say every Lightning has a personality. Some are smooth and polite, others temperamental, snarling when the magnetos don't line up just right. There's one in California that refuses to start unless the left engine fires first. Another in Australia only idles clean when the hangar doors are open. It's superstition, sure, but after 8 decades, Superstition feels like part of the operating manual. These machines were built in war, raised in chaos, and they still remember both. For historians, the P-38 is the physical proof that the idea of too much airplane was a myth. It weighed nearly twice as much as most fighters of its time, carried a full ton of guns, ammo, and armor, and still moved like lightning in its name. Pilots who transitioned to early jets said the Lightning handled better at 450 miles per hour than many jets did at 600. That's how far ahead it was. It taught an entire generation that drag and weight were just challenges waiting for imagination. In the Pacific, it changed the very psychology of air combat. Japanese doctrine had been built on the idea that agility wins dogfights. The Lightning proved altitude, power, and patience win wars. It wasn't elegant in the samurai sense. It was efficient in the industrial sense. It didn't duel, it executed. Even when a Lightning pilot missed, he rarely had to worry about being caught. One push of the throttles, and the fight was over. He was gone, a streak of silver vanishing into the clouds. On islands where wrecks still rest, villagers treat them like relics. Children grow up playing around the corroded wings. Elders tell stories about the silver bird that hunted the sun. Divers find frames nearly intact, instruments still frozen at combat settings. The dials, crusted with salt, read 18,000 feet, 320 miles per hour, fuel nearly empty. It's as if time stopped mid-mission and never started again. Every so often, teams recover one. The restoration starts like an archaeological dig. Slow brushes, cataloged bolts, reverent silence. Then, months later, the aluminum skin gleams again. The cockpit smells of fresh leather and old history, and the Lightning breathes once more. When it finally lifts off, it's not just a flight, it's resurrection. People watch through tears, some from joy, some from memory, some from pure disbelief that something built to fight can still create such peace. For engineers, the fascination never ends. The way the radiators are buried in the wing roots, the turbochargers tucked deep in the booms, the control cables routed like veins through a living thing. It's art masquerading as machinery. Computer models still can't fully explain how it stayed so stable at those speeds. It just did. That's the line you hear most from anyone who's flown one. It just did. Pilots today, flying composite-bodied jets with fly-by-wire computers, still look at the Lightning with a kind of envy. It was analog perfection. You felt every ounce of lift through the stick, every pulse of torque through the rudder pedals. You didn't manage it. You partnered with it. When you banked at 25,000 feet and saw sunlight flash off both propeller arcs, you understood what control really meant. And beneath all the data and design and myth, the Lightning carries something else, a kind of moral gravity. It represents the moment when humanity learned that imagination could be weaponized, that intellect itself could decide the fate of empires. It was terrifying, but it was also beautiful. It was proof that progress is indifferent. It serves whoever reaches it first. So yes, the Japanese pilots laughed when they saw it the first time. And yes, the laughter died quickly. But what came after wasn't just fear. It was respect, the kind that lingers long after the war ends. Because deep down, they knew what every pilot eventually learns. The sky doesn't care who laughs. It only remembers who masters it. And somewhere high above the Pacific, where sunlight still hits the clouds just right, you can almost imagine it. Two faint trails weaving together, then splitting apart, the echo of two engines fading into distance, the twin-tailed ghost of a machine that refused to be ordinary, still keeping watch over the endless blue it once ruled. Some say the Lightning had a soul because it behaved like it did. It punished arrogance, but rewarded precision. Push it too hard, and it bit back with a deadly stall. Treat it with respect, and it would carry you home with one engine torn away and half your rudder missing. Pilots called it temperamental, but truthfully, it just demanded competence. In the Pacific, where fuel leaks and tropical storms killed as many men as the enemy, that competence meant survival. And somehow, the Lightning became an extension of those who flew it, twin hearts beating together at 2,700 revolutions per minute. There's a story of Major Thomas McGuire, America's second highest scoring ace, chasing a Japanese P-38 over Luzon. The Lightning bucked under high Gs as he pushed through cloud and turbulence, both engines roaring near redline. McGuire's wingman radioed, "Tom, break off, she's too tight." But McGuire stayed with the turn, his Lightning holding on longer than physics should have allowed. It was a machine that would kill the unskilled, but reward the brave. His courage cost him that day, but his legend, along with his Lightning, became eternal. The Japanese pilots learned fast. They realized they couldn't outclimb it, couldn't outrun it, couldn't outgun it, so they tried to ambush it from below the sun to lure it into turning fights. But even when they had the advantage, the twin engines of the P-38 often ruined their trap. One quick dive and it was gone. Then seconds later, back from above, descending like divine judgment. There are countless mission reports from the Imperial Navy that end with the same haunting phrase, "Lost sight of the twin tail." Even the radio chatter of the era captured the shift in tone. Early intercepts were mocking, Silver Dragon clumsy in clouds. Later ones were resigned. Avoid twin tail at all costs. The Lightning wasn't just feared, it was respected. It was the enemy they measured themselves against, the benchmark of a new kind of aerial warfare. When Lockheed's engineers back in California heard those stories, they didn't gloat. They just smiled knowingly. Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the design, had built the Lightning not for style, but for purpose. He'd drawn it with a slide rule and intuition in 1937, predicting the future before anyone else saw it coming. "The war will be fought at altitude and speed," he said. He was right. The P-38 fought above the clouds while others gasped for air below. Years later, when jets arrived, engineers still studied the Lightning's aerodynamics. Those long, laminar wings, the intercooler placements, the counter-rotating propellers, all of it decades ahead of its time. Even stealth designers quietly admit that the twin-boom structure influenced later aircraft. Its silhouette became a legend, equal parts menace and beauty. But beyond the machinery was something human. For every dogfight victory, there were pilots who used their Lightning for mercy. It could fly thousands of miles over open water, making it the perfect search and rescue escort. Pilots would spot downed airmen floating in rafts and circle above for hours, calling in rescue craft, tipping wings in reassurance. Many survivors of the Pacific War owe their lives to that Silver Guardian watching from above. And when the war finally ended, many Lightnings were scrapped, cut apart with torches, their metal sold as surplus. The pilots who had flown them stood and watched, helpless. Men who had faced death without blinking found themselves crying over machines, because they knew they weren't just losing airplanes, they were losing something that had shared their souls. Decades later, as restorers rebuild surviving Lightnings piece by piece, they sometimes find messages scrawled inside the panels, chalk notes from factory workers, scribbled prayers, a line from a song. "Bring him home safe. Give him hell. Fly high, brother." Every rivet, every bolt carries fingerprints from people who believed in what they were building. Today, when one of those rare Lightnings flies again, the world stops for a second. People hear that deep twin-engine harmony, the twin hymn, some call it, and feel history vibrating in their bones. Cameras shake as the silver arrow streaks past, sunlight catching on its wings like a flash of memory. It doesn't just remind us of war, it reminds us of what imagination can build when pushed by necessity, when fear is turned into invention. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just America's first modern fighter. It was proof that ingenuity could be deadlier than ideology. In the end, Japanese pilots didn't just learn to fear it, they came to admire it. Because even in war, warriors recognize greatness when they see it. And long after the gunfire stopped, the memory of the twin tails still haunted the skies, a sound that meant death once, but now means legacy. If you listen close, you can still hear it. Two engines roaring in perfect balance, the sky parting before them, the horizon reflecting silver. The lightning doesn't just belong to history, it belongs to eternity. In the early months of 1943, the Lightning had already earned its reputation in the Pacific, but its story was only beginning to unfold across every island chain, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. The Japanese soon realized that wherever the twin tail appeared, death followed in precision formation. Its arrival wasn't sudden. It was surgical. The silver flashes that shimmered in the tropical sun carried a sound unlike any other. A deep, synchronized rumble that echoed through the jungle and over the sea. The Marines called it the sound of protection. The Japanese called it the sound of doom. What made the Lightning terrifying wasn't just its speed or firepower, it was its reach. No Japanese aircraft could pursue it to its maximum range. It could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, chase fleeing fighters hundreds of miles, and still make it home. In the Pacific, distance was death. Yet the Lightning turned it into an advantage. When Japanese pilots returned to base low on fuel, exhausted and shaken, the twin tail was still in the sky, waiting. Its design, alien to anyone who saw it for the first time, was pure American audacity. Two engines, twin booms, a central pod. It looked more like a spaceship than an airplane. Japanese pilots first thought it was two planes flying side by side. Then they learned that each half of the machine worked in perfect harmony. If one engine was shot out, the other pulled it home. Try to set it on fire, and its self-sealing tanks would smother the flames. Try to outrun it, and it would climb higher, faster, like it owned the sky. But the Lightning's deadliest weapon wasn't its design. It was the men who learned to exploit it. Pilots like Richard Bong, Charles McDonald, and Thomas Lynch became legends not because they were reckless, but because they understood how to weaponize the aircraft's very physics. In the hands of a novice, it was dangerous. In the hands of an artist, it was unstoppable. When the Japanese High Command began analyzing combat reports, confusion turned to disbelief. Their top aces, men who had survived China, Pearl Harbor, and the early Pacific campaigns, were vanishing in dogfights they should have won. They couldn't understand how these massive twin-engine fighters could dive faster than their Zeros, pull up harder, and still shoot straighter. But the truth was in the Lightning's guns, 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose, all firing perfectly along the same line of sight. No need for convergence, no guessing angles. The pilot pointed, and death followed. Imagine a single 2-second burst, a dozen rounds of 20mm high-explosive shells mixed with over 100 half-inch slugs traveling at 2,900 feet per second. At 300 yards, that was a wall of lead slicing through air. Most enemy planes didn't just fall, they disintegrated mid-air. Pilots described watching Zeros melt apart when hit by a lightning burst. In one infamous encounter, a formation of P-38s ambushed a Japanese convoy off New Guinea. They dove in near vertical, screaming down from 25,000 feet, releasing their bombs with deadly accuracy before switching instantly to gun runs. In less than 5 minutes, they had turned a fleet into flaming wreckage. Japanese survivors who made it to shore reported that the sky itself seemed alive with fire, the twin tails diving, rising, circling, returning. It wasn't combat anymore. It was domination. The psychological effect was immense. The Japanese pilots had grown up in an Air Force culture that glorified agility and close combat. The Zero was their pride, light, elegant, unbeatable in a turn. But the Lightning changed the rules. It didn't dance, it struck. It made dogfighting obsolete. Its pilots stayed fast, attacked from above, then climbed back to the heavens where the Zero couldn't follow. It was technology defeating tradition in real time. And that was the part the Japanese command never understood. They kept sending their best men into battles already lost before takeoff. Pilots who had trained for graceful duels were now being hunted by machines designed for raw physics and industrial power. The Lightning's existence signaled a fundamental shift. Air combat was no longer an art. It was science, precision, and mass production. Some pilots tried desperate tactics. They hid among clouds, hoping to ambush from below. Others climbed at dawn, thinking the Lightning's engines couldn't handle thin air. But every tactic ended the same way: smoke in the sky, oil on the ocean, and one more victory mark on a Lightning's nose. There's a declassified Japanese intelligence report dated late 1944 that reads, "Engagement with twin-boom enemy aircraft results in unacceptable losses. Fighter groups are advised to avoid contact when possible." That was the Empire's official acknowledgement that they had no countermeasure left. But it wasn't just in combat that the Lightning rewrote the rulebook. It also performed missions that no one thought possible. It escorted bombers across oceanic expanses, scouted enemy harbors with cameras mounted in its nose, and even carried bombs when necessary. The P-38 was a Swiss Army knife of destruction. Fighter, interceptor, bomber, and spy are all in one metallic body. When General Kenny of the 5th Air Force needed a precision strike on a high-value target, he didn't send bombers. He sent Lightnings. Their pinpoint accuracy and blistering speed made them ideal for decapitation missions. One of those missions would change the Pacific War forever: the interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor. It was April 18, 1943. U.S. cryptanalysts had intercepted a coded Japanese message revealing Yamamoto's flight plan. 16 P-38 Lightnings were selected to execute the interception, flying a 1,000-mile round trip over open ocean. At precisely 9:34 a.m., they appeared over Bougainville Island at exactly the moment Yamamoto's formation arrived. It was surgical perfection. In less than 90 seconds, the Lightning pilots had annihilated the escorting Zeros and shot down Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber. The admiral who once said he would dictate peace terms in the White House now lay dead in a jungle. And it was the Lightning that delivered the message. That mission proved something extraordinary. Not only could the P-38 dominate the skies, it could change the course of history. No other fighter of the war combined that range, speed, and precision. It was the perfect blend of engineering and execution. After that, Japanese morale began to crack. Every pilot knew that somewhere above the clouds, the twin tail waited. They called it Ni no Ashi, the two-legged demon. Legends spread through airfields, stories of pilots who never saw it coming, of gunners who fired until their barrels glowed red only to see their rounds bounce off its armored skin. When captured Japanese pilots were interrogated after the war, they spoke of the P-38 with the same tone usually reserved for earthquakes or typhoons, unstoppable forces of nature. One even said, "When the twin tail comes, you pray not to see it, because if you see it, it's already too late." That's the paradox of the Lightning. It was terrifying, but not cruel. It didn't hunt for glory. It hunted to end war faster, cleaner. It was humanity using technology not to prolong destruction, but to master it, to control it. Every time those twin engines started up, something primal stirred in the air, a reminder that innovation can be a weapon, and that under pressure, creativity becomes the most dangerous force of all. The Lightning was more than an airplane. It was America's message to the world. We can build anything, fly anywhere, and reach you, no matter where you hide. After Yamamoto's death, The Japanese military tried to conceal the loss, but the shock rippled through every rank like a silent earthquake. Officers whispered in disbelief, pilots grew superstitious, and airbases that once buzzed with bravado fell unnervingly quiet. The idea that the Americans could strike so precisely from so far away seemed impossible, almost divine. But it wasn't divine. It was the lightning. It had hunted the Empire's most untouchable man across the ocean, hit its target with mathematical accuracy, and vanished back into the clouds before anyone knew what had happened. For the Japanese, that mission became a ghost story. For the Americans, it was proof that technology had changed the rules forever. From that day forward, the P-38 Lightning wasn't just another fighter. It became the symbol of inevitability. Wherever it flew, resistance meant extinction. It wasn't the kind of fear born from rumor or myth. It was mechanical, cold, and absolute. Pilots on both sides began referring to it not by name, but by presence. The twin tail was here, they'd say, the way people talk about storms. In the Solomon Islands, it became the terror of the skies. Its pilots, now veterans, had perfected a form of aerial warfare that bordered on art. They fought in 3 dimensions, always above, always faster, always choosing when to engage and when to vanish. The Japanese Zeros, once the apex predators of the Pacific, had become prey. They could outturn anything, except bullets moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Reports from Japanese survivors describe scenes that bordered on surreal. Entire squadrons would vanish in moments, erased by lightnings, diving from 25,000 feet. Wreckage rained down into the jungle. Fires burned on beaches for days, and every dogfight ended the same. No bodies, no parachutes, just the echo of twin engines fading into silence. But the Lightning's dominance wasn't just about firepower. It was psychological warfare wrapped in polished aluminum. Japanese pilots were taught that honor was worth more than life. To be outmatched wasn't shameful, but to be outclassed, to fight something beyond comprehension, that was unbearable. And that's exactly what the Lightning did. It stripped away their confidence piece by piece until all that remained was fatalism. Every mission deepened that divide. The P-38's range allowed it to patrol areas previously untouched by Allied aircraft. It escorted bombers to Rabaul, raided convoys along the Bismarck Sea, and annihilated shipping lanes that Japan depended on. Even the mighty Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, which once terrorized Allied positions, became flying coffins under Lightning guns. When American pilots intercepted them, the fights lasted seconds. A single burst from the Lightning's guns could rip through a Betty's fuselage like paper, detonating fuel tanks and turning the aircraft into a mid-air fireball. It wasn't just fighter squadrons that feared the twin tail. It was the entire Imperial command structure. Field reports began to include desperate measures, false flight paths, decoy convoys, even fabricated radio chatter to confuse Allied interceptors. None of it worked. The Lightning's combination of radar coordination, long-range fuel tanks, and raw speed made ambushes impossible. By late 1943, Japanese pilots had developed a saying, "You don't see the lightning until it's shooting at you." That wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was battlefield truth. Its natural aluminum finish reflected the sky. Its engines made less noise at altitude than expected, and its attack dives were almost invisible until it was too late. Even radar operators struggled to track it. It came fast, low, and vanished higher than pursuit aircraft could reach. Meanwhile, American pilots were perfecting tactics that took full advantage of the Lightning's design. Instead of turning fights, they fought vertically, diving, climbing, and using gravity as their co-pilot. Their motto became boom, zoom, and climb. In one pass, they could deliver a hurricane of gunfire, then rocket back up into the thin air where the Japanese couldn't follow. Those who flew it began to describe the experience with reverence. Colonel Charles MacDonald once said, "It wasn't flying, It was controlling an earthquake with wings. Another pilot, when asked what it felt like to dogfight in a P-38, said, "Like being inside a weapon instead of behind it." But there was a darker side to that power. The Lightning demanded discipline. If a pilot mishandled engine throttles or failed to balance torque properly, the plane could flip into a deadly spin. It didn't forgive arrogance. More than a few young men learned that lesson the hard way. The very thing that made it superior, its complexity, could also betray those who didn't respect it. Still, for those who mastered it, it was invincibility personified. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 aerial victories, flew his P-38 like it was an extension of his body. He wasn't flashy. He was precise, methodical, terrifying. His Lightning, nicknamed Marge, became as famous as he was. Japanese pilots wrote reports describing a white-nosed twin boom that seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with supernatural precision, and vanish without a trace. They didn't know it, but they were describing Bong. Another ace, Charles Lindbergh, yes, that Lindbergh, flew combat missions in the Lightning later in the war. He wasn't supposed to, but he did anyway, testing new fuel efficiency techniques that would extend the Lightning's already incredible range. His contributions allowed U.S. pilots to reach previously unreachable targets, proving again that the Lightning wasn't just a machine of war. It was an evolving idea. By 1944, the P-38 was more than a weapon. It was a doctrine. American strategy began to revolve around its reach and versatility. Bombers struck farther, convoys sank faster, and the Pacific Islands fell one by one like dominoes. Each victory carried the unmistakable signature of the twin tail. As the Allies advanced, Japanese commanders grew desperate. They began sending inexperienced pilots, some barely out of training, into combat. Many didn't even know how to counter the Lightning's speed or tactics. What had once been duels between skilled opponents became slaughter. The P-38's kill ratio soared to nearly 12-1 in some regions. Even kamikaze pilots feared the Lightning. It could intercept them before they reached their targets, using sheer speed to shred suicide planes before they could dive. In the final year of the war, American carrier groups often slept easy when P-38s patrolled overhead. The Lightning wasn't just an offensive weapon anymore. It was a shield. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, thousands of Lightnings were scattered across the Pacific, some still gleaming in the tropical sun, others rusting on coral runways. Their mission was complete, but their legend was only beginning. Mechanics wept as they stripped the aircraft for parts, knowing they'd never see anything like it again. The Japanese, too, remembered it. Not with hatred, but with reluctant respect. When former pilots wrote memoirs in the decades after the war, they often mentioned the Lightning by name. They didn't romanticize it. They acknowledged it. "We could not defeat the twin tail," one veteran wrote. "It was not a plane. It was an era." And he was right. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just an aircraft. It was a turning point in aviation history. It proved that technology could break tradition, that engineering could outthink valor, and that the future of war would belong not to the bravest, but to the most inventive. To this day, when a restored P-38 takes to the skies, it carries more than noise and nostalgia. It carries the sound of evolution, the echo of an age when the sky stopped belonging to heroes and started belonging to machines. The Lightning was the bridge between those worlds. It was the death of chivalry and the birth of modern air power. The Japanese laughed when they first saw it, calling it awkward, unnatural, even foolish. But by the time the war ended, no one was laughing. The twin tail had spoken, and its language was dominance. After the war, the Pacific was quiet for the first time in years, but the silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The jungles still hid wreckage, engines half buried in vines, twisted wings jutting out of coral lagoons, fuselages split open like old bones. Among those relics, one shape appeared again and again, twin booms stretching toward the sun. Even stripped of its paint and power, the P-38 Lightning still looked alive, as if the sky might call it back at any moment. For many who'd seen it in its prime, it was more than an airplane. It was an omen, a promise, a mechanical ghost that refused to fade. The U.S. military, however, had already moved on. Jets were rising from runways in California and Ohio, sleek, smooth, and future-bound. Propellers were obsolete, or so the engineers said. But veterans who had flown the Lightning shook their heads. "You can't replace that kind of soul," one of them told a young Air Force mechanic in 1946. "You can only forget it and regret it." Lockheed's factories, once roaring around the clock, quieted down. The production lines that had birthed thousands of P-38s fell silent, covered in dust and echoes. Workers who had built the twin-tail killers went home, their jobs replaced by the whisper of jet turbines. Yet even in that stillness, something lingered, a sense that the Lightning wasn't done teaching the world what flight could mean. The lessons of the Lightning went far beyond combat. Its twin-engine design influenced the birth of twin-jet fighters. Its central nacelle inspired cockpit ergonomics for generations. The concept of redundancy, the idea that a plane could survive half dead and still fly home, became standard doctrine. Every modern aircraft owes part of its soul to that philosophy. But its influence wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. The Lightning had changed how pilots thought. Before it, fighter pilots were lone duelists, artists of the sky who relied on instinct and agility. After it, they became tacticians, engineers, thinkers. You didn't just fly a P-38, you managed it. You respected its systems, learned its personality, treated it as a partner, not a tool. That mindset shaped generations of aviators long after the war ended. In the late 1940s, many Lightnings were sold as surplus for a few $100s each, less than the cost of a good car. Farmers bought them to strip for aluminum. Collectors bought them for scrap value. A few madmen, test pilots, daredevils, romantics bought them to fly. Those who did said it felt like stepping back into another world. "You don't pilot it," one said, "you negotiate with it. You offer your life, and it decides whether to give it back." The P-38 became the unsung backbone of the New World. Some were converted for photo reconnaissance during the early Cold War, their cameras capturing the first images of Soviet installations from impossible distances. Others became weather aircraft, mapping storms, chasing typhoons, flying where no one else dared. One even surveyed the Arctic ice sheets, its engines howling in the frozen silence like a ghost from another century. And then there were the wrecks, frozen in time, waiting. In 1992, on a glacier in Greenland, a team of adventurers stumbled upon one. A P-38, buried under 268 feet of ice, perfectly preserved, as if waiting for orders. They called her Glacier Girl. It took years to dig her out piece by piece, using steam and patience and faith. When she finally flew again in 2002, 60 years after she had last tasted air, people wept openly on the runway. Her engines roared like thunder reborn, and for a few minutes, it was 1943 again. That moment reminded everyone what the Lightning truly was, a bridge between eras. It was built at the edge of impossibility, a machine so advanced it scared even its own pilots. Yet it had grace, beauty, and a kind of quiet rage that never truly died. When Glacier Girl lifted off, the old veterans who had flown her sisters said it felt like the war was finally ending, not in bitterness, but in peace. The P-38 also left its mark far beyond the military. Hollywood borrowed its silhouette for every futuristic craft from the 1950s onward. Comic book artists copied its twin tails for alien ships and superhero jets. Even modern stealth fighters owe part of their shape to the Lightning's bold geometry. Its image became shorthand for power, twin, balanced, unstoppable. In Japan, the stories of the Lightning lingered for decades. Former Zero pilots, now old men, would speak of it with a mix of dread and admiration. It was not an enemy, one said during an interview in the 1970s. It was a force of nature. We didn't fight it, we survived it. When asked what he meant, he smiled sadly. Because sometimes it let us live. That strange mercy haunted him for the rest of his life. Back in the United States, the Lightning became a symbol of a time when ambition had no limits. Its pilots became test pilots, astronauts, engineers. The same men who had flown it over New Guinea and the Philippines went on to fly rockets, design spacecraft, and build the supersonic age. They carried the Lightning's lessons into the stars: precision, balance, trust. Even when they sat in cockpits orbiting Earth, they think of that first machine that taught them how to respect the sky. By the 1960s, only a handful of P-38s still flew. Each one was a time machine, old bones held together by faith and grease. Air shows would hush when its engine started. That deep, twin-engine rhythm made veterans stand taller. Kids look up in awe, and even jet pilots fall silent. The sound wasn't just nostalgia, it was reverence. Because the P-38 Lightning wasn't just a machine. It was proof that human will could bend metal into miracles. It showed that courage could be engineered, and that beauty could be built for war, yet remembered for peace. Today, only a few survive. Each one is restored like a cathedral, with reverent hands and whispered prayers. When they fly, people don't just watch, they feel. You can sense the weight of history in every vibration, the ghosts of those who never came back, and the pride of those who did. Every turn of those twin propellers is a heartbeat of the past, reminding us that freedom was forged not just by men, but by the machines that carried them. And among all those machines, none carried their story quite like the Lightning. The Japanese mocked it. The skeptics doubted it. Even its own engineers feared it might be too much plain for the world. But history proved them all wrong. The Lightning didn't just survive. It transcended. It was the sound of progress, the shape of victory, the proof that imagination could fly. And though decades have passed, every time one of those silver arrows takes flight, the sky itself seems to remember. The clouds part, the air vibrates, and somewhere, if you listen close enough, you can almost hear the whisper of the old aces.
The twin tail is back.
The Lightning's legacy didn't fade with the dawn of jets. It simply transformed. Every time a pilot strapped into an F-86 Sabre, an F-15 Eagle, or even an F-22 Raptor, they carried a ghost of that twin-boom pioneer with them. Because the Lightning wasn't just an aircraft, it was the blueprint for how humans would conquer the air for the next century. It taught aviators that speed alone wasn't enough. You needed endurance. That power meant nothing without balance. That design wasn't about elegance. It was about intent. The P-38's intent was absolute dominance, and that philosophy became the DNA of every fighter that followed. Lockheed never forgot its masterpiece. Inside the company's archives, engineers still talk about the Lightning Line, that invisible thread connecting the P-38 to the U-2, the SR-71, the F-117, and beyond. The obsession with altitude, with range, with perfection in asymmetry. It all started there. Kelly Johnson, the man who drew the first Lightning sketches by hand on drafting paper in 1937, would later lead the Skunk Works team that created the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest aircraft ever built. When asked what prepared him for that challenge, he said, "The Lightning. It taught us that anything is possible if you ignore the word impossible. Even the shape of the SR-71, with its twin engines stretched apart along its fuselage, owes a silent debt to the Lightning's twin-boom geometry." The design logic lived on, a balance of extremes, engines far apart to tame torque, symmetry built for survival. What started as a World War II fighter's necessity became an aesthetic of power, recognized the world over. But beyond engineering, the P-38 became something larger, a cultural myth. In the years after the war, it symbolized a kind of righteous ingenuity, the moment when humanity's creativity burned brighter than its destruction. Hollywood used its silhouette on movie posters. Painters captured it slicing through sunset clouds, silver against crimson skies. Musicians named songs after it. Writers compared it to gods and angels and lightning bolts hurled by Zeus himself. For a generation that had seen the world nearly destroy itself, the twin-tailed lightning became a reminder that we could also build things worthy of awe. Its pilots became legends whose stories grew with every retelling. Old men in leather jackets sitting at air shows telling kids about the time they saw tracers carve through night skies, or the smell of hot oil after a hard landing, or the sound of a comrade's laughter in the radio static. They'd tap the airframe with wrinkled hands and say, "She brought me home." And for a second, they weren't old anymore, just young, fearless, and immortal again. The lightning had a strange way of outliving time. It shouldn't have. It was a relic from the piston age, too heavy to be romantic, too industrial to be sleek. But maybe that's why it endures, because it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be graceful. It's a machine that looks exactly like what it is, a weapon that fought the darkest war in history and came out the other side unbroken. Every time one flies today, it gathers the sky around it like a cloak. The twin propellers cut the air with that deep, rhythmic growl that no jet can ever mimic. Spectators feel it in their ribs before they see it. Children stare. Veterans go silent. Photographers lower their cameras because the moment feels too sacred to capture. It's not nostalgia. It's reverence. Some call it the last warbird that still feels alive. Others say it's haunted, that every flight carries the echoes of the men who never came back. And maybe that's true, because when the sunlight catches that polished aluminum just right and you see the reflection ripple across those twin tails, it's impossible not to imagine the Pacific. The heat, the chaos, the bravery, the loss, all of it stitched into every rivet. The lightning wasn't perfect. It was loud, unforgiving, over-engineered. It demanded everything from the pilots who flew it. Every ounce of focus, courage, and humility. But in exchange, it gave them something they couldn't explain. Not just survival, but transcendence. The kind of flight that made men understand why humans looked to the sky in the first place. You could call it the first truly American fighter, not because of where it was built, but because of what it represented. Invention over imitation, boldness over caution, function over tradition. While other nations refined existing designs, America invented something new, something that shouldn't have worked, but did. That's why the P-38 became more than a machine. It became an idea. Its very shape told a story. 2 booms for balance, 2 engines for resilience, 2 tails for stability. It mirrored the duality of the age itself, destruction and creation, death and rebirth. The lightning was both storm and sunlight. The flash that breaks the darkness and the silence that follows. When you think about it, every modern aircraft still carries a bit of that contradiction. The F-35 might fly stealthier, faster, higher, but its mission, to dominate without mercy, to strike before being seen, is the same creed the lightning wrote in the clouds of the Pacific 80 years ago. The technology changed. The ambition didn't. And somewhere, in a hangar or on a museum floor, a lightning rests under dim light, her silver skin scarred with history. Kids press their faces to the glass, imagining what it must have felt like to fly something that could shake the earth. And if you listen close enough, maybe you can hear the faint hum of twin engines, still ready, still restless. Because legends don't die. They just wait for the next takeoff. So when the Japanese pilots laughed back in 1942, when they pointed at those awkward twin tails and called them foolish, they couldn't have known they were looking at the future. They were seeing evolution in metal form. They were mocking the storm before it hit, and when it hit, it rewrote everything. It turned mockery into awe, fear into respect, and flight into mythology. The twin boom silhouette became an icon, a warning, and a promise all at once. The Lightning was proof that the impossible could be built, flown, and lived. Even now, decades later, every rumble of a piston engine echoes a little bit of that thunder. Every pilot who looks down through the clouds owes a quiet debt to the men who once rode those twin trails of fire across the sky. Because the P-38 Lightning didn't just fight a war, it changed what it meant to own the sky.